guess one of the reasons we got here today was Leo a long time ago, who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather.
Nestled against the San Gabriel Mountains near Pasadena, California, is a gateway to the solar system and beyond. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory. A NASA facility, it has been managed since the time of its creation by the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. When visitors first enter the laboratory's museum, they are greeted by an image of 3 space pioneers from a half-century ago, captured in a moment of celebration. Explorer was forged war, at a time when JPL was building not spacecraft, but missiles that carried atomic weapons. This is the story of how JPL entirely changed direction and purpose. This is also the story of a satellite that would give the world the very first space science discovery, one that would change our understanding of how life on Earth came to be. White Sands, New Mexico. This is where JPL conducted test launches of its Cold War missiles. Close by is the Trinity site, where the United States detonated the first atomic bomb that brought World War II to a close. The lab's origin, 1936, when a group of Caltech students and enthusiasts began conducting modest rocket engine tests. Those hand-to-mouth efforts would have likely died had not the U.S. Army seen uses for the rocket. By 1945, JPL's work was at the forefront of American knowledge of rocketry with this missile, the WAC Corporal. Though many Caltech professors wanted to abandon classified military work at the war's end, the arrival of the Cold War only intensified the pressure to tap the Institute's expertise in rocketry.
In a certain respect, World War II has never ended. Modern weaponry and arms racing pose a great challenge to the very values that we Americans were defending. How long could it remain a free society if it had to become a garrison state, an arsenal?
JPL's WAC Corporal was only an experimental rocket, but in the fall of 1945, a new group arrived at White Sands with rocket combat experience. Some 120 German engineers who had built Hitler's V-2. Over 3,500 of these missiles, each armed with a ton of high explosives, were launched against European Allied cities in the last year of the war. But as Germany collapsed, the leader of the V-2 team, Wernher von Braun, led members of his group away from their rocket facility to avoid capture by the Russian army. During the escape, von Braun was injured, but he succeeded in his plan of surrendering to the Americans. The capture of von Braun, many of his engineers, and a stockpile of V-2s were among the greatest spoils of the war.
Wernher von Braun, there's a dark side to his background in Nazi Germany. Building a rocket is one thing. Building it for an evil regime, using concentration camp labor that is worked to death, beaten to death if they step out of line, and thousands of people died in the process of building V-2s. In the 1960s, Tom Lehrer, the satirist, wrote a song about Wernher von Braun, and one of the phrases from that was, "The rockets go up and where they come down, that's not my department," said Wernher von Braun. In other words, he wasn't concerned about what you do with these things or with the process you go to build them. He just wants to build his rockets.
The Army wanted to learn all it could about von Braun's V-2. Over 60 of them would be launched from White Sands.
There was, at first, a sense, okay, we'll bring him over for a short period of time. We'll learn what we can from this group, and then we'll send them back home. And that didn't happen.
Von Braun quickly Americanized himself. Charming and a born marketeer, he would become the most recognizable advocate in America for space exploration, spun visions of a new generation of missiles, and put forth grander ambitions: Earth-orbiting satellites, excursions to the Moon and Mars, and a battle station capable of raining nuclear devastation from orbit, thereby establishing once and for all military superiority. In their first encounters at White Sands, the German and JPL groups found themselves side by side, sharing the same launch pad and hangar. There was no doubt who had the larger missile. The tail end of this V-2 dwarfs a nearby JPL rocket. The JPL team, though, was not particularly impressed. They were ahead of the Germans, they believed, in guidance and control, and feelings about the war were...
The war was just over. There's a lot of suspicion about what von Braun and his team represented. There undoubtedly was a certain amount of rivalry as well. And in fact, Louis Dunn, who was became director of JPL in 1946, actually refused to allow von Braun onto the laboratory grounds at one point until the colonel, who was the liaison person at JPL, basically said, "Yeah, they're part of the Army too, and you should let them on." So I think there was certainly a lingering tension.
It took 2 years, but in 1947, the Army had the teams working together. A 15-ton V-2 was mated with JPL's smaller WAC Corporal, which served as the upper stage. This combined multi-stage rocket was nicknamed the Bumper WAC. On the fifth launch attempt in February of 1949, JPL's upper stage soared to a height of nearly 250 miles. Though it did not go into orbit, the JPL rocket became the first object to reach beyond dispute the boundary of extraterrestrial space. A year later, a Bumper WAC was also the first rocket ever to be launched from a mosquito-infested swamp in Florida bearing a name few knew how to pronounce and even fewer had ever heard of: Canaveral. The sense of accomplishment, though, had already been overshadowed by the knowledge that the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, years ahead of expectations. America's atomic monopoly was over, and the world was about to plunge deeper into the Cold War. One Cold War dilemma facing the United States was how to defend Western Europe against a Soviet invasion without deploying a permanent full-scale army, a prospect that would damage the American economy. The solution was the strategy of deterrence. The Soviet attack would be countered with nuclear weapons. With tensions mounting, the Army pressed JPL to transform its research on a test missile into an operational weapons system to be deployed in Europe. Called the Corporal, this short-range missile was to be used near the front lines. Specifications called for hitting a target with relative precision at a range of 75 miles. In charge of building the Corporal was a Caltech professor, destined to become JPL's next director, the New Zealand-born William Pickering. The taciturn Pickering lacked the flash of a Wernher von Braun, but he was just as tenacious and as ambitious.
When the Army came to the lab and said that, look, now the Germans have this V2, we want you guys to do some research on trying to understand the longer range ballistic missiles, long range in those days being 100 miles, like a V2. The Corporal rocket was a radio-controlled, radio-guided rocket. It performed reasonably well, although the fact that it was a rehash of a research device, never really a very good production rocket.
Pickering had once half-joked that JPL could do anything, but building the Corporal proved a humbling assignment. While the first test went well, the next few were disastrous.
You know, we had some that went south. The term "went south" means we fired them from the launch area in White Sands, and the firing range was north. And south of the firing range was Mexico and Juarez and what have you. So it was not good to go. But we had some that actually, instead of going up this way, they went the wrong way. They went south.
As a way of acknowledging the rocket's setbacks, JPL produced for the Army a self-satirizing film called The Corporal Story. The Army brass laughed at the film, but they continued to press to have the Corporal deployed. Matters weren't helped by a list of growing requirements. Better accuracy was demanded under all kinds of weather conditions. Though originally envisioned as carrying an atomic warhead, the option of biological or chemical payloads was also tested. The complications of launching a Corporal from White Sands paled in comparison with a launch attempt in the field. The toxic nature of the fuel made for hazardous conditions for the missile crew, even in a non-combat environment. The training of crews revealed that getting into firing position required as much as 4 hours of preparation, to say nothing of an entourage of personnel that on an open road often stretched for more than 12 miles. Once designed, the production line was turned over to industrial contractors. More than 1,000 Corporals would be built. With a reliability rating of only 60%, the Corporal rushed into the field in 1955. Though marginal as a weapons system, the presence of the rocket was hoped to be a psychological deterrent, as the nuclear warhead the Corporal carried was 3 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the mid-1950s, JPL had tripled in size. The work was serious and intense, but JPLers played just as hard. Think of a sport, any sport, and more than likely, JPL had a team. There were baseball teams, basketball teams, bowling teams, archery clubs, chess clubs, golf clubs, gun clubs, motorsports clubs, and even a UFO and a woodchoppers club. When they weren't competing for fun in the daylight hours, they might be found socializing and dancing the night away at the Elks Club. There were summer dances, fall harvest dances, masquerade dances, winter dances, and the spring coronation ball. Here, the laboratory director crowned a new Miss Guided Missile. The director by now was William Pickering, who reveled in this coronation duty. This beauty pageant contest was an eagerly awaited social event. Each year, competing groups at the lab mounted elaborate campaigns to have their candidate bestowed with the title of Miss Guided Missile. It was all a way to blow off steam, for back at work awaited their jobs, which, one way or another, male or female, was about the serious business of building missiles for the Cold War. What the Army wanted next was a faster, less complicated, and more accurate missile. The answer was to go back to the solid fuels JPL had pioneered in the 40s to propel planes into the sky.
Guided missiles, bound to explode, destroying my heart, is your goal.
Purpose of Sergeant firings number 11 and 12 will be to test fire the first two fully guided experimental model Sergeants to an assigned target. Two identical...
The Sergeant was a second generation to do about the same job, but to take advantage of all we learned and to know from the very beginning we started to design it for field use in a military situation.
But relations with the Army were beginning to fray, especially when JPL cautioned that as many as 50 test rounds of the Sergeant might be needed before arriving at a deployable system.
It was pretty obvious that the lab was probably coming to an end with its work for the Army. That the lab, as a part of Caltech, was feeling that the work we were doing was not really very appropriate.
Pickering and others were envisioning a new future for the laboratory. If they had their way, the Sergeant would be the last missile JPL would ever build. All of the U.S. military branches saw uses for rockets tipped with nuclear warheads. But President Eisenhower was intrigued by another use for missiles.
Reconnaissance satellites, spies in the sky.
Nikita Khrushchev had rejected Eisenhower's open skies proposal to use airplanes for mutual reconnaissance. How hostile, Eisenhower worried, would the Soviet Union be to a satellite flying overhead?
The great question hanging over the inauguration of the space age was, is it legal to orbit satellites over the territory of other countries? Is outer space subject to the same airspace laws that airplanes have to obey? It's not legal to fly U-2 airplanes over the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union doesn't permit it. Their airspace is an extension of their national sovereignty, extending upward. Usque ad coelum, in the Latin phrase, even unto the heavens.
In 1955, a potential solution to the problem appeared. Physicist James Van Allen was helping
NASA's InSight lander received a gift of sorts, a new discovery. InSight recorded a significant Mars quake. That's what we call quakes. But scientists learned only later the cause of that shaking, because the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, also known as MRO, was able to see from space what the lander detected. I'm Raquel Villanueva, and I'm your host today here at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California. Today's science team members from the InSight lander and MRO mission will explain how data and images from their spacecraft contributed to the discovery. Joining us virtually are Bruce Bannert, InSight Principal Investigator at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory; Lilia Posiolova, Orbital Science and Operations Lead at Malin Space Science Systems; Ingrid Daubar, InSight at Brown University; and Lori Glaze, Director of NASA's Planetary Science Division from NASA headquarters. We'll be taking questions after hearing from our speakers, so if you're a member of the media on the phone lines, press *1 to be put in the queue, and if you're on social media, use the hashtag AskNASA. I'll now hand it over to Bruce.
Hi everyone, I'm Bruce Bannert. I'm the Principal Investigator of the InSight mission. I'm speaking to you here today from Lockheed Martin Space, where the Spacecraft Operations Center is located. InSight has been on the surface of Mars since November of 2018, listening with its seismometer and various other instruments, weather instruments and so forth, to what the goings-on on Mars. And we're here today to talk about a new discovery that we're really excited about in terms of the first time that impact's actually been observed by a seismometer and then observed also from space by the orbital cameras. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the spacecraft status on Mars. Can we have the first image, please? As you probably know, as InSight's been sitting on the surface of Mars for the last 4 years, it's been collecting a lot of dust on its solar panels. This is a picture of the solar panels a couple of months ago, and you can see that it's really, really dusty, and that's cut down our solar power. And we've been sort of cutting back on the operations of the spacecraft as that's happened in order to squeeze out as much science data as we can. About a month ago, we got an additional challenge to the spacecraft. If I could have the next image. This is a global mosaic of Mars. It was taken over the course of a day. It shows a large dust storm in the southern hemisphere that started kicking up about a month ago. If you go to the next image, we can see the dust storm shown in the orange, so you can see where it is. Fortunately, that dust storm did not move over InSight itself. InSight is over on the right side of this image, one of those spots on the right side of the image. And so that was really fortunate, because if it had passed over the spacecraft, it would have darkened the solar panels and we probably would have lost the spacecraft. But unfortunately, since this is such a large dust storm, it's actually put a lot of dust up into the atmosphere, and it has cut down the amount of sunlight reaching the solar panels by quite a bit. We went from about 400 watt-hours per sol, which is the units that we measure the spacecraft pound, to less than 300. We had to shut off the seismometer for a few weeks. We are now operating the seismometer again, only 1 day out of 4 at this point, to conserve our power. But even in that, at that relatively small amount of use, the batteries are still slowly being depleted. And so what we believe is, in the next short amount of time, perhaps somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks, as best we can predict, we expect the lander to not have enough power to operate any longer, and we'll lose contact with the spacecraft. So that's a sad thing to contemplate, but InSight has been working marvelously for the last well beyond the intended lifetime of the mission, which was 2 years. We've been collecting data, and even now, as we're winding down, we're still getting these amazing new results. If I can have the next animation, this is an image showing that the relative locations of the InSight lander over on the left-hand side of the image, and this impact that caused a crater that we were able to pick up with our seismometer and that was later imaged with the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. I can show you the seismic data, and actually you can hear the seismic data. What we've done here is we've speeded up the vibrations that we measured with the seismometer up into the range that we can actually hear with the human ear. So times, if you were actually on Mars, you would feel the shaking, but you wouldn't be able to hear it. But this way, we can actually, transmit it over the internet, and you can experience it. This is about 45 minutes of seismic data, and you'll be able to hear it in a little less than half a minute. So if we can go ahead and roll that animation now, you can listen closely to the sounds of Mars. And what you've experienced there is, you can see in the image, was the P wave coming in, the first wave that comes from any seismic event, and then the big bulge there is the S wave, and then buried in that is actually the surface wave, which is one of the real interesting findings from this new event, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Lilia Posilova to talk about how this really interesting discovery was made.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lilia Posilova, and I work at Mainland Space Science Systems. We design, build, and operate cameras on spacecraft. May I have my first image, please? I oversee operations of CTX, Context, and MARSI, Mars Color Imager, on board of MRO, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter spacecraft. In last year, a meteoroid struck Mars and created the largest fresh impact crater we have observed in 16 years of MRO mission. May I have my next image, please? When we first saw this image, we were extremely excited. This was nothing like we've seen before. It took entire view of the CTX image. It's a 30 kilometers width, and even we needed to take 2 more images on the sides to capture the entire protuberance area. We do see regularly small craters with in our CTX field of view. And how do we do it? We acquire CTX images based on our various scientific objectives, and we for any changes. And typically what we see, it will be like a little smudge. And then we compare to all the available previously data sets to confirm that it is fresh or not fresh crater. And typically they are on the size of up to 20 feet, small craters. And time constraint, we can do few years, maybe occasionally down to 1 year. The protuberance that this impactor created was so large, then we thought maybe we could see it in our other camera view. It's our, may I have my next image, please? It's our lower resolution. And to see that strong of a signal in that camera view, it's huge, very rare. We were able to time constrain this impact down to about a day, slightly over 24 hours. And then I recall that InSight reported back in December that they recorded this large seismic event on Christmas Eve. When we compare seismic epicenter with location that we pinpointed from the orbit and the time, we were able to match this large seismic event to our large impact crater. This is by far the largest jointly observed crater recorded seismically and observed from the image. May I have my next slide, please? As ball light travels through the Mars atmosphere, it creates a Mach cone. And as a result of it, you see dust perturb on the left of the crater. A lot happens as the meteoroid strikes Mars. rock gets fractured, there is atmospheric blast, ejecta gets thrown out, crater gets excavated. And effect of that dynamic all got preserved in the Martian surface, and we captured it in our CTX image. We see the crater itself at about 150 meters in diameter. We see bright patches of ice. This is most equatorward ice we've seen on Mars. The ability to tell what happened, when, and what activity occurred, along with the largest impact crater, are two huge discovery rates, the value, increased value that joint work of two missions brings. And I will turn to Ingrid to look at more details of the impact itself.
Thanks, Lilia. My name is Ingrid Daubar. I'm on the team for the HiRISE camera, which is another camera orbiting Mars on MRO. If I can have the first visual, please. HiRISE is a high-resolution color stereo camera that lets us see things as small as a desk on Mars. I also help lead the Impacts Working Group on the InSight mission. HiRISE and CTX have been showing us new craters, as Lilia said, forming on Mars for a while now. So we were hopeful we could detect some of these with the InSight mission. We want to study impacts with InSight because they can tell us not just about the craters themselves and the cratering process, but also about the interior and the atmosphere of Mars. Sources with a known location and size can help calibrate all of the other data we've gotten from InSight, all those quakes where we don't know the exact epicenter. After 3 years of listening, we thought impacts probably have to be the lander or very large to be detected seismically. We recently found 4 small impacts close to InSight, but we never thought we'd see anything this big. So we were super excited to hear about this discovery by Lilia and her team and have the chance to study it in more detail with HiRISE. Could I have the next image, please? From this HiRISE image, it was immediately clear that this is the biggest new crater we'd ever seen. It's about 500 feet wide, about 2 city blocks across. And even though meteoroids are hitting the planet all the time, this crater is more than 10 times larger than the typical new craters we see forming on Mars. We thought a crater this size might form somewhere on the planet once every few decades, maybe once a generation. So it was very exciting to be able to witness this event. And to be lucky enough it happened while InSight was recording seismic data. That was a real scientific gift. Crater caused was a magnitude 4 quake, which on Earth is big enough to be felt, but not big enough to cause a ton of damage. About 1,000 or so quakes of this size happen on the Earth every year, but Mars is less tectonically active than the Earth. So for Mars, this was a pretty big one. Can I have the video, please? Most exciting of all, we saw clearly in the high-resolution images that a whole lot of water ice had been exposed by this impact. You can see in this flyover video of the 3D data boulder-sized chunks of ice in the crater's ejecta, as well as splotches of ice thrown across the landscape outside the crater. This was surprising because Mars is the closest to the equator we've ever seen water ice. So scientists are going to be able to use this to constrain the past climate conditions on Mars, when and how this ice was deposited, buried, and preserved up until now. This is a huge opportunity to study a really large impact event from both the orbit and the ground, a reminder of how privileged we are to have multiple missions studying Mars at the same time. It's been really exciting and fruitful to be part of these two projects working together. And now I'll hand it over to Lori Glaze.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. So InSight, what an amazingly successful mission where we've learned so much about Mars's crust, the interior, and more. As you heard from Bruce, sadly, we're likely nearing the end of the InSight mission, but what an awesome capstone science result to end on. I mean, literally going out with a bang. The observation of the December 24 impact by the InSight seismometer, as well as the orbital imaging, is really exciting, not just for gathering important new information that will refine our understanding of the crustal structure, but for other really important science as well. As you heard, it's the largest impact crater seen on Mars since we've been observing. Asteroids are found throughout the solar system, and they play a really important role in planetary surface processes. So these observations are going to help contribute to that knowledge. To give a little context on this particular asteroid, the expected size range of the object that created the crater was likely between about 5 and 12 meters across. And, asteroids of that size actually enter Earth's atmosphere on the order of about once a year. We see those pretty regularly. But because Earth has a thicker atmosphere, asteroids of this size burn up and are generally pretty harmless. If I could have the first graphic, please. I just want to speak for a moment about the importance of the discovery of ice, just below the surface. This is really an exciting result. We know, of course, that there's water ice near the poles on Mars, but in planning for future human exploration of Mars, we'd want to land the astronauts as near to the equator as possible to ice at these lower latitudes. That ice could be converted into water, oxygen, or hydrogen. That could be really useful. If I could have the second graphic, please. So let's just go back to where Bruce started. You've heard that the power production on InSight has been dropping, that the mission will likely end sometime in the coming 4 to 8 weeks, in the next couple of months. This mission has been a really big success in the 4 years it's been operating. I want to take a moment to acknowledge this incredible team that has met many challenges along the way. They've met the challenges of the soil of Mars not cooperating and the challenges of the heat probe, challenges of waiting for those quakes, those first quakes, and waiting for the data to really start delivering what we were looking for. And of course, the dust accumulation and the valiant attempts by the team to extend the lifetime of the mission by cleaning some of that dust off the solar arrays. I've known Bruce and several of the science team members for many, many years, and I know how much emotional energy goes into those years of planning and execution of a mission like InSight. And I know it's going to be hard for the team and for all of us to say goodbye, but I just want to say I couldn't be prouder of all this team has accomplished. I want to close by saying thank you to Bruce and the entire team for all they've done to advance our understanding of Mars. And with that, we'll go back to Raquel.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori. Now we'll move it on to Q&A. So if you're a member of the media on the phone lines, you can press *1 to get put in the queue. And for social media, you can use the hashtag #AskNASA. And we do have some social media questions coming in. First off, Mrs. Whiskers1 on Twitter asks, "Anything that surprised you?" And Bruce, I think she is talking about InSight in general.
Well, there's been a lot of things that surprised us, actually. It would have been a pretty boring mission if we didn't get surprised. We were surprised at first by how quiet Mars seemed to be in terms of seismic activity. It was 3 months before we actually even saw an earthquake, and that was my fingernails were getting pretty short by the end of those 3 months because we were really depending on getting Mars quakes. Once we started getting Mars quakes, we realized that what we'd done is we'd landed in the windy part of the year, and so all the Mars quakes were getting covered up by the wind, and so that was a big relief. The next big surprise was the issues with the mole. We were surprised by the properties of the Martian soil. It was unlike the properties of the soil that we had seen previously at the Viking landing sites, at Spirit and Opportunity and Curiosity. InSight landed in a spot where the soil was a little bit different than what we expected, and that made it impossible for our mole to penetrate. So that was an unpleasant surprise, but scientifically it was actually very interesting because that showed that Mars was a lot more varied than we had thought before. Finally, some of the results from our seismic experiment, the results of the deep interior, surprised us. The core appears to be quite a bit larger than we had imagined. We thought it was going to be about 1,700 kilometers or so, and it was actually over 1,800 kilometers in radius. And that has some really important implications for the evolution of the planet Mars itself. And so that's a big surprise, one that we haven't actually been able to our theories yet. And so this impact was sort of the latest in a long series of surprises that we've had over the mission.
Thanks. You summed it up well. Mars is full of surprises. Thank you, Bruce. Now, we do have a caller on the line, and if you could please direct your question to one of the speakers. We have Megan Bartels from space.com.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thanks for taking my question. I was hoping, Bruce, if you could go into a little more detail about the significance of detecting surface waves for the first time, and then sort of how to use that information to better understand the crust.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I mean, this is surface waves were something that we had anticipated in our data analysis from the very beginning of our planning. We thought we were going to use surface waves to locate quakes, use the surface waves to probe the structure of the crust, the upper few tens of kilometers of the planet. But for the first 3 years of the mission, we saw no surface waves. And we believe that that's because the Mars quakes are a little bit deeper than we anticipated. And so the surface waves aren't really developed large enough to be able to detect with our seismometer. So now that we do have surface waves, it's already telling us a lot of really interesting stuff about Mars. The nice thing about surface waves is they tell you about the crust, not just where the lander is sitting, but they look at the crust as they're moving a path between the event, in this case, the impact, and InSight is sampled by these surface waves as they move across the planet. And so we have an idea of what the crust is over this fairly long path. It's about 3,500 kilometers for one of these events, and almost 7,500 kilometers for the other one. And we find that the crust is different. Again, the InSight landing site is a little bit unusual, or at least different than the pathway that these surface waves took. And so we found that the crust under InSight has a layer about 10 kilometers deep that is a little bit lower velocity, lower density than what's indicated by the surface waves. So surface waves are telling us about the crust, not just at our wide area on Mars. The other thing that is great about the surface waves is that they help us to refine our location, refine our seismically determined location. And we find that by incorporating that with the body waves, the P and the S waves, that helps us, again, to zero in on the location in which the impact is found.
Thank you for your answer, Bruce. Now, remember, if you're a member of the media on the phone lines, you can press *1 to get put in the queue. And social media, use the hashtag AskNASA. And we do have some more social media questions coming in. We have Andrew on Facebook who asks, how often do you discover a Lilia, Ingrid, would you like to both take that?
Sure, I can take that. So CTX has been looking for these ever since MRO went into orbit about 16 years ago. And Lily can tell you more about the CTX process to find them. But since then, we found about 1,200 new impacts. Sometimes there's a couple craters there, sometimes there's just one. But again, they're much, much smaller than this one.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, yeah, indeed, we relatively regularly do find them, but again, they are much, much smaller, and they, on our CTX field of view, they look like a little smudges. So when previous data sets, we're looking for that change, and sometimes we see what maybe looks like a fresh crater, but then if we look at all the previous data sets and we find that, say, previous image was taken 3 years ago, oh, it's still there, and then 5 years ago. And if that's all the previous images we have, we can call them a fresh crater. But yeah, we find many fresh craters, and as Ingrid mentioned.
Great, thank you. And we have another caller on the line, Mark Carreau from Aviation Week and Space Technology.
Thank you, and I apologize if you already answered this, but what was the distance, or what is the distance between InSight and the impact?
That's about, yeah, thanks for your question. It's about 3,500 kilometers between the where InSight is located and the location of this crater.
Great, thank you, Mark. And also on the line, we have Ken Kramer from Space Up Close.
Hi, thank you for doing this. Very exciting results, and thanks for taking my question. I want to ask you about the ice that you found. I'd like to know, how surprising was it to find ice at that particular location? How long did it remain on the surface? Because I know ice melts, evaporates pretty rapidly there. And I'm wondering, you have radar instruments there too. What did the radar instruments tell you about subsurface ice in that location? Thanks. Bye.
I can take that. This was a big surprise because this is the closest to the equator that we've seen ice exposed in an impact. However, there have been a number of all these other impacts that we found, much smaller and closer to the poles, that have also exposed water ice. Before this, I think the closest one was a few degrees north of this, so it wasn't totally out of range of what might be expected, but it was still very surprising. Of course, this crater is so much bigger than all the other ones we've seen, and it excavated so much deeper that we're getting down deeper in the shallow subsurface. And then your other question was about, how long the ice lasts. Yeah, so we have sublimation of ice that's been exposed in this way when we use HiRISE to take images over and over again to monitor the sites, and we can actually see the ice disappearing in most cases. And it doesn't last long. It's not actually stable at the surface at these locations. This one, again, it's fairly new, but we have seen some evidence of that happening, but I don't think it's really been studied in detail yet.
Anything about the radar results from that area about ice?
Not to my knowledge.
Right. Thank you. And we also have another question coming in on social media that is related. Bart on Twitter asks, how would you know if the ice wasn't contained to the meteorite itself?
I can take that too. Yeah, that's a really good question. We thought about that. Like maybe this was a cometary impactor that was just made of ice, and what we're seeing on the surface is just splashed out from the impactor itself. But an impact of this size would actually destroy the meteoroid that came in to hit the surface. We wouldn't expect much, if any, of the original impactor to survive this high energetic. It's about it's a high energy explosion. So we can look at that, and we can also look at the lobes found, and that also shows us evidence that it's probably not from the impactor itself, but rather was excavated from below the surface.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. We have one more. Oh, okay. We actually are out of questions for today, so that is all the time we have today. Thank you, and I'd like to thank all the speakers for their time today. So to stay up to date with InSight, visit mars.nasa.gov/insight and follow @NASA Insight on Twitter and Facebook. And for more information on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, visit mars.nasa.gov/MRO. I'd like to thank everyone for watching today.